it's really about not acknowledging like what is required by my customer and by my market, and where do I need to lean into productization and just try to be more efficient because that's how we need to compete, and where do I really need to lean into being more flexible because the problem space that I'm in is so nuanced that it requires that. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel and I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I am your host, as always, Marcel Petitpas, joined again by the one and only Kristen Kelly.
Hi, Marcel. Lovely to be here.
Lovely to see you again. We just took a cab to the airport together a couple days ago. We just wrapped up our quarterly planning in beautiful Montreal, Canada, and it was great hanging out with you for a few days.
I had a great time. Yeah, super productive and also just a lot of fun. Yeah. So the cab ride at 4 a.m., not the best, but it was a good nonetheless, good company, right?
I wish we were in as good of spirits at that time of the day as the people who were just pouring out of the bars on our street at that same time that we were waiting for our cab. What an experience that was.
Truly. Yes.
Yeah.
Amazing.
That is in the past for me, and I think we could say the same for you.
That is energy I have not seen or experienced in probably a decade. Yeah. It's so sad to say that. Oh my God.
Yeah. If I'm inebriated and on the street at 5 o'clock in the morning, something's very, very wrong and you need to get me some help. But I digress. We are here today to talk about productized services versus custom work, and hopefully to have a bit of a more nuanced discussion about this than we tend to hear in the industry. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kristen, to drive this conversation. Why talk about this?
Yeah. So I think, you and I were talking about this, and our point of view really is that one isn't really better than the other. And that may be a different take than, some folks who are in this space, just because there's just a lot of dialogue about it in general, just a lot of takes, a lot of information, much of which does try to steer in the direction of productization for one reason or another, just because of some of the more, some of the outcomes, right? They seem a little bit more simple on the surface. But I think what we're here to talk about, to your point, is the nuance, to each side of that coin, and why there's a case for both, depending on the nature of the work that someone is doing. So yeah, we're going to dig into both sides again, and, let's dig in. And I think maybe a good place to start would be, what does it mean, or what do we think it means to productize a service? How do we define that?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And so I think there are a lot of definitions that you might hear about when it comes to productization out in the market. And to your point, there are a lot of thought leaders out there that are spending a lot of time teaching firms how to productize and espousing the many benefits of productization, which are very real. There are lots of reasons that productization might be a really good idea for your firm and help you become more profitable. But because there are a whole bunch of different thought leaders, many of which have ironically productized intellectual property coaching services to help agencies productize, all of which are trying to, come up with their own unique framework. You hear a couple of different definitions, but the way I look at this is productization, there's sort of two sides to it. And the main one is you are presenting a productized solution to your clients in the sales process. And there's an assumption that this means that there is a lot of standardization or productization that occurs on the back end. And while that's often true, it's not inherently the case. And I think the misconception around productization for a lot of folks is that in order to productize a service, it has to be exactly the same every single time for every client. And they often conflate sort of the standardization of a process with the standardization of outputs or outcomes. But truthfully, the simplest way to think about productization would be to say, we are going to get you this outcome for this price, for example. even if the process that you have to use to get that outcome for a couple of different clients looks different, whether it's very different or a little bit different. But the other extreme version of that would be, you get this outcome where you get these deliverables for this price, and this is our process, and it's very, very standardized. And that, I think, for a lot of people is the goal of a productized service, is to create more standardization, both in the sales process, which can have some benefits, and also in the delivery process, which can also have some benefits.
Yeah. And I think, you touched on how this can become rigid if you let it. And I think that's really one of the misconceptions as well. And I see a lot of creative agencies kind of shy away from productization because they're just afraid that becoming so rigid in their process will then prevent the outcome, the ideal outcome, which is that creative outcome that we're talking about. So there's just, it's good to define it, because I think, to your point, the outcome is the ideal state, but that's what you're trying to achieve when you sell a productized service. It's not like, oh, this little factory assembly line of a thing that you're just running through your agency. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you're sort of pointing to is the relationship between positioning, which is also a very popular topic as of late. And I say as of late, like for the last decade or two in our industry, and productization. And these are sometimes seen as being intrinsically linked, or sometimes they're almost spoken about as if they're the same thing, or they're sort of inherently related to one another, but they are somewhat different. But we see the same resistance from, in particular, highly technical, highly creative firms on both of those fronts, which is, this is going to limit our possibilities. It's going to limit the variety of work that we do. It's going to limit the opportunities that we get. And in some cases, that's true. But in a lot of cases, it's not. And it's actually just more about doing more or getting more of the opportunities that we want, that we know we're best suited to, and ideally becoming more efficient, more scalable, more profitable in the process. But know that you can be really clear about what problem you solve, who you solve it for, and the process that you use to solve that problem, without actually going all the way towards productizing or standardizing your process. And understand that process has many altitudes that it can exist at, right? We can describe a process at like 100,000 foot altitude, which is like, we figure out why, we develop a plan, we execute on that plan, and then we follow up and support you. Like, that's technically a process, even though it might look completely different from one client to another. So understand that there is a massive spectrum that you can define a process across, and do so in a way that creates clarity for a client without actually creating really any restriction for how you go about accomplishing something. So anyway, I digress.
Um, so we say that there are actually benefits to both. And I think if most agencies that I encounter these days kind of have an opinion one way or the other, a pretty strong one, strongly held opinion. So I think maybe let's start with talking about some of the upsides to productizing, and then we'll get into the flip side.
Yeah, and I'll just dovetail on what you said in sort of, I think this is a Hormozy quote, but it's a very true thing, right? It's the grass is greener, or as he likes to put it, there's the shit you know and the shit you don't. And I think this is a tendency, right, for most entrepreneurs, especially in the agency space. You run an agency, you look at all the SaaS founders and you think, oh my God, it would be so much better to run a SaaS company. Or you look at the coaches and you think, oh my God, it'd be so much easier to run a coaching company. Or you do custom services, you look at somebody who's doing productized services and you think, oh my God, it would be so much better to do productized services. But I've also heard the inverse, people that have gone all the way into productization and then, they're missing opportunities, or they're slow to change things, right? And we'll talk about the downsides, and they look at people doing a bunch of custom work and they're thinking like, oh, I wish that we could just do that. So with all that said, let's talk about why you might want to do productized services. So theoretically, the outcomes that you should be able to accomplish through this would be a faster sales cycle, and ideally more sales, or more volume of sales. And the reason that you would get that is because it's so much clearer what someone is buying, what they get, right? You don't have to figure that out on every sales conversation and then go through what can often be a very laborious process of understanding needs and requirements, developing a customized proposal, negotiating that proposal, going through multiple rounds of, revisions on that proposal. In some case, you might have to sell an entire engagement just to figure out what the heck the client needs and what you're doing for them, and going through the whole long process of defining that can take a sales cycle that might be a few weeks and lengthen it to several months in some cases. It can also, of course, get you down to a templatized contract that takes, a couple minutes to spin up, a templatized SOW that takes a couple minutes to spin up. And then we get into all of the sort of back end potential benefits. The more standardized this thing becomes, you can start to standardize things like onboarding and what kind of people you need to bring on, and create templates for things. And theoretically, what this means is the process just becomes more and more and more repeatable. Therefore, it becomes more and more and more scalable. And there's just less thinking and less problem solving to do along the way. And then what that should lead to, of course, is more profitability, because ideally you can make investments in this process that make it faster, that make it easier, that have it require less judgment to go through, which means you can usually hire less expensive people to do a larger swath of the work that's happening. Or in some cases, maybe not hire people at all because you're able to automate things. And so through all of those mechanisms, especially if you are moving towards flat or value-based pricing models that are not compensating you based on time, right? Then you can really start to get the benefit of getting the same thing done with a lot less time and a lot less expense. That's theoretically what you're trying to get after here with a productized services. So better, faster sales cycle, and hopefully better, faster, and more efficient delivery, ultimately resulting in higher profitability.
Yeah. I think I would add to that too, just the ability to forecast, meaning what you can put a container around the effort that's going to be required pretty easily and be able to project that out, and scenario plan based on certain types of things, closing and the corresponding effort too. So that's really helpful. I think that's also a benefit. I think for sure.
Totally. Yeah. There's a lot of operational benefits that you could experience from like a forecasting, pricing, scoping, staffing, all those kinds of things. That's definitely a factor. Although I will talk about, when it comes to custom work, there are ways to structure the business where you do 100% custom projects, and you can still structure it in such a way that it's not a nightmare to do all of those things. So more on that later. That's a little Easter egg.
Yeah. Well, do you want to kind of switch gears and talk about the benefits of custom work too, the upsides there? So conversely, what does it look like?
Before we talk about that, maybe let's talk about some of the potential downsides of productized services that maybe people don't consider. So, the first one is that this might not actually be the way that the problems that your market wants solved need to be solved, right? And so, again, it's not to say that you can't productize what you're selling to them, but the level of productization or standardization where you're trying to like run every client through the same process may not actually work for them. And so this is where, if you're solving big, complex technical problems, or you're solving very sort of novel UX problems or design problems, there's a reason that there's still firms out there that do massive custom projects. And so if it's a mismatch with your market, then you may not actually have as much success in the sales process, or you may be relegated to a smaller subsection of clients within the industry that happen to fit your exact process and don't need, this more sort of customized or fluid approach. The other thing that I think is often overlooked is how much productization can slow you down from a change perspective, right? So, the downside of product, and this is like especially true when you look at technology, but this is true about all product investments, is they all start with negative value and they all create debt, right? And it's debt that shows up in a bunch of different ways. So what do I mean by that? Well, every investment in product starts with negative value in the sense that it adds more complexity and more things that need to be maintained to the product and to the process, right? So if I, for example, write a new SOP on how to do onboarding, well, I need to maintain that SOP now. That's a thing that has a cost, and that cost is going to continue to compound over time as it exists. So I don't get value from that SOP until it's used and creates more efficiency than the time and cost that it took me to create it and maintain it over time. If I write a line of code, if I create a template, right, all of these things have a cost and a maintenance cost. And if, let's say, we develop 30 investments in a process, and now that process changes, or AI comes out and completely disrupts the way that we're doing things, or the market shifts and we have to completely change what we're offering and selling to the client, then in some cases, we're worse off by having this very rigid process that we've made investments in, because we're going to be a lot slower to change, because now we have all of these things that we need to go back and fix and update and maintain. And so there is a level of rigidity that can be created when we productize and make a whole bunch of investments to get more efficient. So there is a double-edged sword to this, but this is something that we do not talk about nearly enough in our industry. We all talk about investing in process like there's absolutely no downside to it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you shouldn't invest in process, but you have to understand that there is a trade-off here and there is an operational drag that can be created. This is the reason that a company like Google might be getting torpedoed by a company like OpenAI, or the reason that a company like Netflix takes out a Blockbuster, right? Bigger organizations with more rigidity, more maturity in their products and processes, they're slower to change. So that is something that I think you do have to consider when you're really thinking about leaning into productization and making a lot of investments in efficiency.
Yeah. And I think you made a great point about the, considering the nature of the work, especially work that's naturally iterative, inherently full of things that you don't necessarily know from the onset. So many of the agencies that I work with that do some form of like web work, dev work of any kind that try to productize and hand over a flat fee to a client, do find themselves really struggling with what do I do when there's constant needs for the backlog to change. They're not necessarily on a T&M abstracted T&M contract, but they wish they were, right? Because the scope is changing. It's not fitting into that neat productized package that was sold up front, and it's just an uphill battle from there to finish within the container and make a profit. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I do want to double click on it just a little bit more because I think it is a really important point. We talk about this a lot in our pricing model quadrant content, which I will link in the show notes, which talks about the different pricing models. But to your point, right? We talked earlier, or I talked earlier about, is this the right match for the problem that's being solved? And you've touched on something really important, which is, does the contract structure match the way in which the scope is going to move over time? And so one of the downsides of a productized service, if you're moving towards flat rate billing or a deliverable based or fixed scope kind of model, is if it assumes that the scope is fixed, and if the price is tied to the deliverables and the scope and not time, then every time the scope changes, the contract now needs to get dealt with before the engagement can move on. And you just raised a really good example. Let's say we're building custom software and we're using the agile methodology. So we know that every 2 weeks, our job is to challenge the assumptions we made and adapt and reprioritize the backlog, and in some cases remove things and add new things and make changes. Then a flat rate contract is going to be in the way all the time. Every 2 weeks, we now need to renegotiate the scope of work. That's going to slow us down so much. It is literally in conflict with the way that we have to work in this contract. And the second point that you made, I think, is a really important one. If we are moving towards flat or value-based pricing, we're taking on more risk as the firm because we're assuming that we have correctly estimated what it will cost us to get the work done. But if we're doing high risk, fluid work that's likely to change, then that risk may not actually end up getting us any benefit. And it's very often that we see firms end up on the wrong side of that equation, and they end up less profitable than they otherwise would have been had they just charged on time materials. In fact, one of the things that we have observed over 7 years of, looking at different agencies is there have been a handful that have been massive outliers in terms of their profitability because they really did all of these things well. But by and large, the firms that are doing productized services on flat or value-based pricing versus the firms that are doing time materials, there is not a significant difference in profitability between those firms. Because a lot of them that do lean in the direction of productization, even though theoretically there is a higher upside in terms of profitability, very few of them manage to execute on all the right things in all the right ways and have the amount of luck that in some cases is required to actually get a material amount of upside and get compensated for the risk that they take on a consistent basis. So something to keep in mind is you can lose that bet if you're not really deliberate about it, or if you just don't price in such a way that you're giving yourself enough room to absorb the risk that you take on.
Yeah. Let's actually keep double clicking on that and kind of explain, this value risk quadrant and productized services. So it's not that you have to stay within the realm of value or flat fees to be a product, to offer a productized service. You can actually explore the other end of that spectrum too. So I wanted to just get your take on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so let's go through like an example of this. And this is where these concepts just sort of start to not make a lot of sense. I'll take the abstracted time materials team leasing model, right? So if by definition a productized service is like an outcome for a given price, well, you could argue that, hey, I'm going to lease you a cross-functional website development team for $10,000 per 2-week sprint. You could call that a productized service, even though there's no standardized process, there's no standardized deliverable or outcome, but there is standardization and there is clarity in terms of like, this is what you get and this is what you get it for. So, it's like, at what point do, like, really, what is the difference between a productized service and really any kind of abstracted time materials? That would be an interesting debate and an interesting conversation. So if you're listening to this, we're gonna clip this. I'm gonna put it on LinkedIn and then we can argue in the comments, because there's a bunch of people in my network that are productized service experts, and I would love to hear their take on this. But by that, in that kind of mode, yeah, you could be handling a totally fluid scope that's changing all of the time. The project could take 100 times longer than what anybody thought at the start of the engagement. And as long as things were managed proactively with the client, your profitability would be fine as long as you priced that sprint in such a way that you had good margins and you were aiming for a 70% margin. And so that's a really good example of how you can use a pricing model to absorb a ton of risk and share a ton of risk with the client, work in a way that's very, very fluid, but still provide a very sort of clear, we'll call it productized kind of offer to upfront. It's just that offer is tied more to the team that's going to be doing the work, as opposed to maybe an outcome or a set of deliverables. And you could argue the same thing would be true for hourly type projects in a case where you don't have enough maybe scope or scale to abstract that to larger increments like days or weeks or cross-functional teams.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that gets really at the core of the misconception in that, people think, and many people think, that you'd have to absorb the risk yourself and offer a flat fee or go toward the value pricing end of the spectrum just to have a productized service because of, the perceived repeatability or, streamlined processes associated to that type of work.
Yeah. Now, I'll also mention that you can sort of have your cake and eat it too, right? There might be a good subsection of your clients, let's call it 50, 60% of the clients that come in that like, yeah, you can really just like run them through your process. It's fairly predictable. You can price that on a flat rate, but then you're going to have a certain percentage that come through that you need to do customizations for. And so, there's also the possibility that you can get a lot of the benefits of productization and better positioning, and also give yourself the ability to tack on, maybe it's more of a time materials model or an overage type clause or some kind of customization that gets tacked on to what is, a fairly solid platform. So I don't know. I just don't see these things as being mutually exclusive. And I think the important thing for people to be doing as they listen to this and consider what's right for them is consider how much risk is there in our engagement, and then how do we account for that risk in our pricing model, in our service delivery, and ultimately in terms of how we present this to clients. Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
Let's actually talk about the flip side, the custom work. It has its own pros and cons. So starting with pros, what do you see being the upsides there?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are certain areas of the market that's what they want. That's what they need. That's what is appropriate to solve their problems. And typically, right, this is a generalization, but typically, the further up market you go, or the further into very technical or difficult or novel or nuanced problems you go, or both, the more there is a requirement for custom solutions. It's also true that custom solutions tend to be more expensive, but that happens to be true on both sides of the equation. They tend to be more expensive to the client because there is a significant additional and a significant compounding cost to all of the additional time that needs to get spent around communication. And that time gets spent, the more complex the project gets and the more stakeholders get involved, they're exponentially going to increase. So yes, the project is going to have a larger scale, meaning it's going to be more expensive to the client. But that's also true about the cost basis of the work as well, right? It's going to take a lot more human capital, a lot more time to get it done. And so typically what that means is there's more risk. However, you could be talking about, let's take a website, for example. What would you pay for a productized website? You're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, typically speaking. Whereas if you're an enterprise company and you need a customized website because you've got this legacy ERP and you have all of these like specific data requirements and you have this proprietary system for how your clients interact with, different parts of the business and order parts or, whatever the case might be, you're probably talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for that engagement. So the deal size is simply larger. And if you're going to make maybe a little bit less profit, but even close to the same amount of profit as you would with a productized service, then the absolute profitability of that engagement could be much, much higher, even if the relative profitability is not much better. So deal size is one thing, the size of clients is another thing. And in some cases, you can be going after problem spaces that are highly valuable because they're super complex and that are less competitive in the sense that there are fewer firms going to those places. And so, this is sort of the thing with the market is that if there are unsolved problems and there are not a lot of people who are willing to go and solve those problems because they're hard, that could be your opportunity to carve out a really good business by finding that underserved need. So all of that to say, you can meet market demand, you can go after bigger clients, you can go after bigger engagements. These are not always true, but they can be true. The other thing that, of course, is, I think, positive about custom work is that it doesn't necessarily require as much infrastructure or as much process. And so you don't necessarily have to be building out and maintaining all of these repeatable systems. You don't necessarily have to try to predict what clients need to the same degree because you can kind of solve for all of those things through your sales process, through your discovery process, through your delivery process. And ultimately, you can be very fluid and very adaptable to where the market is going. And so I would argue that even if you do have a business with a lot of productized services, if there is sort of like a tip of the spear or a problem space that you're exploring or a direction that you're kind of taking the business in, there's a best practice, which is to under engineer that service or that product until you really have a lot of certainty over where the patterns are that you can start to make more rigid. So ultimately it's deal size, it's problem space, and it's being more nimble as an organization. And we could talk a little bit on the back end about some of the ways in which you can think about solving for staffing that really allow you to be nimble even to fluctuations in demand in the market or to the sort of feast or famine cycle that these sometimes large scale custom project firms deal with, which is, you land a couple of huge projects and then you might go 6 months without landing another one because you're dealing with long sales cycles or very timely needs in the marketplace and things of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a sales concern for sure. And then, so you mentioned some of the operational considerations of this type of work too, starting with staffing. So tell me a little bit more about how you might, appropriately staff an agency that does mostly custom work.
Yeah. So, of course, one of the challenges with this is what you need in terms of skill sets and the volumes can be a lot more unpredictable. So you mentioned earlier, like can be very hard to forecast, can be very hard to keep utilization high. And in some cases, you might have this bench of people that are available, but don't have the particular skill set for this custom thing that you're doing because it's custom and it's new. And there might be some elements there that you've never done before. So what does this mean from a staffing perspective? Well, typically the strategy that you're going to look at here is you're going to have a smaller kind of core bench of highly expert, highly experienced people that can oversee these client engagements. And a lot of times you're going to be staffing a lot of the engagement up with more fractional labor. And that allows you to sort of titrate for the more junior skill sets that you need, but then in some cases, bringing in highly expert skill sets in places that you need it. And what you might experience in that case is a higher staff cost relative to what you might have if you had fully sort of in-house full-time staff. But what you gain is more flexibility. So the bet that you're placing there is these places in my business where I'm keeping a bench of freelancers and that are more sort of flexible. Although I might pay a little bit more on the engagement, I'm not going to be paying for their time when they're not utilized. So we can handle big influxes of work and big droughts without necessarily having to constantly go through this like hiring and layoff cycle. So that would typically be the strategy that we would see in a firm like that. And you would hire internally for these roles where you do have a lot of predictability and volume and stability in the amount of work, and try to leave everything else very flexible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so a lot of the clients we see with this type of business model kind of struggle that much more to scope and price effectively that type of work and
Mm.
just get a handle on what it takes to be profitable as a business when they've got like half their labor, let's just say, like out, not within the four walls, so to speak, of their agency. So,
Yeah.
thoughts on this?
So there's a couple of pieces here. The first is that this kind of comes back to what we talked about earlier. In some cases, scoping and pricing the work might not really be, or scoping the work might not really be possible, in the sense that it's going to be highly variable, it's going to be highly fluid, it's going to be high risk, or in some cases, to price the risk in, you would have to ask for some crazy amount of money. And so that's really a place where when you have high risk and high unpredictability, a time materials based kind of model makes a lot of sense. So then your prerogative is really making sure, like, can we get a good margin on the unit of time that we sell to the client? And then the question is, can we abstract that unit of time, which is typically a good thing if you can do it. And it's easier to do the more scale there is in the project. So for example, I would rather sell a cross-functional design team for a UX design kind of thing that we're doing on a biweekly sprint basis for $10,000 per biweekly sprint, and estimate a client project at being between 15 and 25 sprints, and then just constantly update that as the backlog is changing and as we're learning things, then sell that same team on a rate card on an hourly basis, right? I always would move towards the abstracted version of that where I can do it. It helps with utilization, it helps with it helps with resource planning, and it tends to have a higher profitability, and it tends to be much easier and simpler from like a client management expectation setting perspective. And in some ways it gives them a lot more predictability as well. And then you're really focused on velocity as opposed to absolute units of work. So that's something to consider. And then how do we arrive at a price? Well, the thing that we want to pay attention here to is delivery margin. And we generally want to price in such a way that whatever unit of time we're selling has a delivery margin of at least 70%. And so if we have a bunch of contract work that's coming in, we want to figure out essentially how are they being paid, and ideally match that to the time unit that we're selling. So a perfect example here would be, we have somebody coming in and we know that in that 2-week period, we're going to purchase X amount of capacity from them. Let's say it's 10 hours and they cost $75 an hour. So we know that every week they're going to cost us $750 an hour. If we divide that by 0.3, that means we have to charge at least $2,500 for that time unit in order to get the margin that we're looking for. So that's sort of an example of how we could take all of those staff costs and mark them up appropriately. Now, with that being said, that 70% margin typically applies to engagements that are staffed with internal staff, because we have to then take into account all the time that we're paying them for that's not going to end up being utilized. When you're using freelancers and contractors, you might lower that margin target to 60, or in some cases even 50%, because that assumes that you're going to be paying them only for time that is being billable, and you don't really have to carry much or any overhead costs of having them inside the organization. So in some cases, you can lower that target the more you're staffing up an engagement with freelance or fractional labor. in the event that that labor is coming in and it's a very like fixed sort of cost. So like, I'm going to bring in this consultant, they're going to charge me $2,000 to do this thing, and then they're going to bounce, and I'm not having to price them into the unit of time, then I would consider them a pass-through expense. And so you can add markup to that. You can not add markup to that. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. What you want to be focused on is, at the end of the day, what is the delivery margin of sort of the units of time going to look like? And if you can get a little bit more margin by marking up those pass-through expenses, or if you can give yourself a little bit of maybe insurance by marking up those pass-through expenses, then that's a bonus.
We've kind of covered all the upside to custom work and how you would actually logistically address making a profit off that type of work. What would be the downsides to taking a custom approach?
Yeah, well, there's lots of people talking about the downsides of custom work. They'll dramatize them a little bit, right? So the things that we hear are, you can't possibly scale a firm doing custom work. You can't possibly maximize your profitability doing custom work. And what they'll point to is, everything is different every time. It's hard to keep your team busy. You're always going to be sort of tethered to time materials billing, which means that your profitability is going to be capped. And so those things are true in that, like, those are some of the operational challenges that you're going to experience, but you can't be profitable and you can't scale. I mean, all we have to do is look around at the biggest professional services organizations on the planet, all of which have been doing lots of custom work on time materials billing for decades. And many of them are doing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in revenue with thousands or tens of thousands of employees. And so to say that you can't be successful doing that is just like objectively not true. It has its challenges. Yes, you're going to have potentially a little bit more trouble with resource planning, with staffing. You're going to have to, adopt more nimble strategies for that. You're probably going to need a higher degree of expertise and judgment within the organization. You probably will have some projects that go off the rails. You are going to have to use, for the most part, time materials billing models, especially where you're doing high risk work. And yes, you will, have to learn how to manage pricing on time materials. That's probably going to change the way that you sell, the way that you compete. Like, there are downsides, but these are all solvable problems. And the upside might be that you get to solve the problem that you're an expert at in a way that actually solves it for the client, without taking on a crazy amount of risk. All that to say, the downsides are real. There are challenges, but I would argue that there are also challenges with going down the productized route. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just about matching the business model that is appropriate to the problem that you solve in the marketplace and the clients that you solve it for.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned earlier on, just depending on the type of work, it's often natural to kind of start off custom and get in the reps before you're able to even move or be able to consider productizing. So it does not mean that, you can start there automatically just because you want to. Sometimes it's just that's where you are. You're early on. Maybe you're offering a new service line. Maybe you're just exploring a new problem, and that's what it takes to open up that option.
100%. And the other thing that I'll mention about this, actually, and it sort of speaks to the downsides of the custom work approach, is, I mentioned this earlier, custom work is probably going to be more expensive. And in the case where you're working on a really complex or a really big problem for a big company, that could be a feature, right? Like, the absolute size of that deal is going to be larger, therefore the absolute profitability will be smaller. But in some cases, that could be a bug. And that's in particular going to be a bug in places where the value of that service or that outcome is just not that high to the client. Therefore, by doing it in a custom way, you price yourself out of the market, or you force yourself to take on such a low margin that it's not tenable from a business model perspective. So I think this is a place that this sort of context is often the baseline assumption that a lot of the sort of benefits of productized services are talked about, but they're not explicitly called out, which is like, hey, if the price ceiling for this client is I will only pay $10,000 for a website, and you have one firm that's like, yeah, we can build a website for 10 grand and it'll only cost us 2 to get it done, and it'll be done faster, and it's proven to convert for your industry, and it's going to be this really smooth process, and we can show you exactly how it works and give you all this certainty, then like, versus a firm that's like, we only know how to build websites for 200 grand. it's like that's a problem, right? And so I think this is one of the downsides of custom work is, the one of its greatest benefits, which is tends to be for more expensive projects, can also be the greatest downside, which is that for a client that just doesn't value the outcome that much, or in a place where most of your competition has moved to productization and it's appropriate, you're probably going to struggle to compete, or you're going to struggle to have good enough margins to run a profitable business. So I think you really just have to take the context into account.
So we've explored a ton of nuance on both sides of the equation, and I'm sure everyone listening to this episode is kind of mentally going through their setup right now, like their list of custom versus productized, or maybe it's just they have no idea what they're doing. So what type of sequencing, or what would we recommend in terms of just starting somewhere and then moving into a direction that helps, bring some of those upsides to the business, whichever option they choose?
Yeah. I honestly think the pricing model quadrant is like a really good sort of simple starting exercise to do around this. So I will leave a link to that in the show notes. I recommend you go check out that podcast episode and go through the exercise. You draw a 2x2 quadrant, and then you take the things that you do and you take sticky notes or whatever your methodology is, and you kind of place them on the quadrant. And it helps you get an understanding of like, where do they sit in terms of being high value or low value, and high risk and low risk. And then it sort of will point you to a pricing model that tends to be appropriate for that thing. But that is, I think, the exercise to start with, is really get clear on who are the clients that we work with, what are the problems that we solve for them, and what is actually required to get those problems solved, what is appropriate. And I think that'll start to help you clue into, okay, like what is the pricing model that makes the most sense for this type of an engagement, taking into account like where's the market going. And I think that there's sort of two issues that I see, or two misconceptions that I see that are problematic. The first is firms that really should be doing more custom work, because like the problems that they're solving are just that is better suited to it, and it's what the market wants. And they're trying to force themselves into productized services, either because they think that they should, because they've just been hammered with this messaging in the market that like that's the only way to run a profitable firm, and it's the root cause of all of the problems that you're experiencing in your firm, is like everything sucks because you haven't productized, and if you do productize, then all of your problems will go away. Well, that's probably not true for you, right? If the problems that you solve are going to require a lot of customization. And so if that's like one thing that I would really try to, if you're in that situation, try to separate those two things and get clear on like what is actually appropriate for the work that we do. And then how do I just address or accept the challenges that come with that way of working, knowing that there's challenges on the other side as well. And then on the other side, it's folks that have productized their services. And then the other side of this is people that are sort of sticking to the highly custom type of work, maybe because they have some pride around, I don't know, the creative outputs or the technical outputs, or they're sort of really beholden to best practices, but need to be honest with themselves about how much the client cares about those things, what the price sensitivity in the market is, or whether or not any of that is actually necessary to get to the outcome, and where the competition is going, right? And so, I think like if you're selling websites to mid-market companies and you're still running a $200,000 process for that, you probably need a wake-up call, in that like most of the stuff that you're doing probably doesn't matter a whole lot to the majority of your clients, and you're probably coming up against and losing pitches to companies that are doing it for a tenth of that with higher margins, right? And so while that might mean that you need to do more volume, I think you also want to be aware of that trap. And those are the two sort of edges of this where I see the mismatches occur, where it's really about not acknowledging like what is required by my customer and by my market, and where do I need to lean into productization and just try to be more efficient, because that's how we need to compete, and where do I really need to lean into being more flexible, because the problem space that I'm in is so nuanced that it requires that.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you are advising everyone to start off with that value risk quadrant. Really, what I see often happen in agencies is they try to tackle the issue of profitability kind of downstream first. So just starting to chip away at like, oh, let's fix the process in this project management platform, or let's do XYZ little tinkery thing on the operational side, without really acknowledging that more overarching issue at hand, which is just, how are we serving up our services to the market in the first place? Is it setting us up for success?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll just close in saying that, like, I think you've touched on a really good point here. A lot of people that we speak to that are experiencing a profitability problem assume that it is just because of either their pricing or their process. And I think what we've found out is that that's actually usually not the case. Most of the time, the pricing isn't fundamentally bad. And a lot of times their process isn't fundamentally bad either. It's actually just like a more fundamental and in some ways a simpler, not necessarily easier, but a simpler problem in that, like, your team's just not utilized very well, or the structure of your team is just kind of setting you up for failure. So even if you like knocked out of the park on every single project from a pricing and a delivery management perspective, like, you still just wouldn't be that profitable or something like that. And to your point, like, a lot of times they come and see us after having spent months, or in some cases years, like fighting for these little incremental wins and sort of spending 80% of their time on the things that are going to move the needle 20% of the way, as opposed to the inverse, just because they're not seeing that clearly. And so, yeah, just understand that I think fundamental business model design is usually where the largest amount of leverage is. And making the switch from time materials to productized services, in a case where it doesn't have an outsized impact on your ability to go to market or solve the problem better or more efficiently for the client, is probably not going to be that needle mover for you.
Well, let's close this out with where we can point people to go to for more information.
Yeah. Well, I do want to give some shout outs, actually. It's funny. I don't think I don't think I know a single consultant who has positioned themselves as like, I help agencies do custom work, but I know a whole bunch that are all about productization. And I do want to give them a call out, because if that is the path that you want to go down as a firm, or if that's appropriate for you, they're very good. And there can be a ton of upside there. So I do want to call out, Brian Kessman, Anthony Ginden. There's also Greg Hickman at Alt Agency. So those are just like three off the top of my head. There's, I'm sure, more that I could point you towards, but those are some people that, if you're interested in this idea of productization of services, definitely check out their stuff. Also, I think Corey Quinn deserves a shout out here as well. He has done some good work around positioning and productization. So yeah, some people to go check out. And then if you want more resources from us, in particular around pricing, then check out the Agency Pricing Quadrant, and I'll leave links to all of those things in the show notes. Kristen, any resources you want to call out on this subject?
I would just add another name to the pile, which is Chris Dubois. He's a great partner in the space too. And yeah, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't include him too.
100%. Yeah, Chris does have some good content around this also, and does a great summit every year as well, which you should check out. So yeah, good call out. So links to all of those people and resources in the show notes. And with that, Kristen, thank you for guiding us through this conversation today.
Yeah, it was great. Great topic.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.